In recent weeks, international attention has once again focused on Iran. This was triggered by an unexpected statement by Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi that Tehran officially refuses to resume negotiations with the U.S. on its nuclear program. This came just a day after Donald Trump said he was confident that a deal with Iran could be signed as early as next week. But instead of a diplomatic breakthrough, the world saw a harsh response. There are no negotiations, agreements, or even discussions about starting new talks. All rumors on this subject are nothing more than speculation, Araghchi said on Iranian state television. This sharp turn came as a shock to international diplomacy. This is especially true given that just a week ago, a fragile truce was reached between Iran and Israel after a 12-day phase of military escalation in which the U.S. actively intervened. At that time, it seemed that there was a chance to bring the parties back to the negotiating table. Now, however, that chance seems slim. Why is Tehran refusing dialogue even in the face of heavy military and economic pressure? What are the Iranian leadership's goals? And what does this mean for the future of the entire Middle East? These questions require in-depth analysis based solely on verified and confirmed data. That is exactly what we will examine in this video. First, we need to understand why the Iranian leadership has so categorically rejected even the possibility of dialogue with Washington. After all, following the devastating U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on nuclear facilities in Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, it seemed logical to seek to prevent escalation. However, from Iran's point of view, the diplomatic window is already closed. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that Tehran no longer trusts either the U.S. or international organizations. He emphasized, "We have seen how attacks on our territory were coordinated, including on the basis of data provided by the IAEA. We will not allow this to happen again." This statement is backed up by actions. Last week, a new law came into force in Iran officially banning cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. The reason for this was suspicion that the agency's publications were used as a pretext for strikes on nuclear infrastructure. Thus, we are witnessing not just a diplomatic rejection, but a systemic reformatting of Iranian foreign policy. Iran is refusing to compromise, believing that the language of force used by the U.S. and Israel leaves no room for equal dialogue. The rhetoric of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in recent days also confirms this. In his latest speech, he stated bluntly, "The American regime has entered a war to save Israel. We have shown that we can strike them too." This position makes it clear that any attempts at pressure or threats will only lead to an escalation of the confrontation. Against this backdrop, it is clear that Iran sees negotiations not as a tool for peace, but as a way for the West to impose its will, which, given the destruction and losses, has become politically unacceptable. This radicalizes not only the regime's external rhetoric, but also its internal rhetoric, strengthening the position of the hawks within the power structure. The key catalyst for Iran's withdrawal from the nuclear talks was the military operation carried out by Israel and the U.S. in June 2025. At 2:30 a.m. Tehran time on June 13th, Israeli aircraft struck strategic targets in Iran's infrastructure, a nuclear center in Fordow, a missile complex in Isfahan, and research laboratories in Natanz. These were not just demonstrative strikes. They were an attempt to paralyze Iran's nuclear program. The response was immediate. That same evening, Iran launched ballistic missiles at Israeli territory, escalating the conflict into a direct military confrontation. Israel activated its Iron Dome missile defense system, but damage was still reported in a number of areas. This led to a surge of mobilization rhetoric within Iran, with calls for revenge for Fordow. Events then escalated rapidly. On the night of June 21st to 22, the U.S. conducted its own air operation, striking the same nuclear facilities that had already been hit by Israeli bombing. B-2 strategic bombers and Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from submarines were used. The facilities in Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan were attacked with GBU-57 bombs capable of penetrating deeply fortified structures. Donald Trump announced that Iran's nuclear infrastructure had been completely and irreversibly destroyed. However, statements by the U.S. military were less categorical. General Dan Keane reported only significant damage without confirming the complete destruction of Iran's nuclear capabilities. These strikes effectively marked a point of no return for Iran. If negotiations were still hypothetically possible before this point, after the open military intervention by two countries, Tehran saw what was happening as a threat to the very existence of the Islamic Republic. Now, any cooperation, especially in the nuclear sphere, is perceived as a potential tool for surveillance and subsequent attacks. Therefore, not only negotiations but even basic communication with the IAEA was curtailed. The agency's staff remaining in the country were denied access to facilities, and a visit by IAEA Director Rafael Grossi was canceled. Iran's decision to abandon negotiations and suspend cooperation with international bodies is not simply a reaction to external attacks. It is part of a well-thought-out strategic line aimed at shaping the image of a strong, independent state that is not inclined to make concessions even under the threat of war. From Tehran's point of view, U.S. attempts to return to negotiations after a series of strikes on nuclear facilities are hypocritical and politically disingenuous. The Iranian authorities are convinced that if they return to the negotiating table now, it will be perceived as weakness, which will instantly undermine the legitimacy of the current regime within the country. That is why everything has been done to show the world that Tehran is not backing down, but is dictating its own agenda. Iranian officials have emphasized that any talk of negotiations is manipulation, an attempt to weaken Iran's will to resist. In addition, Tehran has relied on information mobilization. State television channels IREB broadcast footage of soldiers preparing for defense, interviews with IRGC commanders, and footage of missiles being launched at Israeli and American targets. These actions are aimed at internal consolidation and strengthening anti-Western sentiment. Against this backdrop, a new law prohibiting interaction with the IAEA has become the legal basis for a new foreign policy course. This is a signal not only to the U.S. but to all international players. Iran no longer intends to play by the rules imposed on it. It is noteworthy that there has been a shift in Iranian rhetoric. Whereas previously the emphasis was on the exclusively peaceful nature of the nuclear program, the focus has now shifted to sovereignty and national defense. This may signal the beginning of a new phase in Iran's nuclear strategy, one that is less transparent and more militarized. After a series of mutual strikes and Iran's official refusal to resume negotiations, the U.S. and Israel found themselves in a strategically disadvantageous position. Despite Donald Trump's dramatic statements about the complete destruction of Iranian facilities, in practice, these actions have not achieved their main goal of forcing Tehran to return to the negotiating table from a position of weakness. Moreover, a domestic political debate began in the U.S. itself, with various centers of influence, Congress, the Pentagon, and the State Department, assessing the situation differently. The U.S. Department of Defense stated that the strikes were a necessary measure, but acknowledged that Iran's nuclear capabilities had not been completely destroyed. At the same time, the State Department preferred a more restrained tone and insisted on diplomacy as the only sustainable mechanism for settlement. Donald Trump, for his part, continued to emphasize the historic significance of his actions. He publicly stated that a truce between Iran and Israel would come into effect within 6 hours, and even named a possible date for negotiations. But the reality turned out to be different. Tehran did not confirm its readiness for either dialogue or a truce. This gave rise to mistrust within the American political class. Many senators openly criticized the White House for its hasty statements, which were not backed up by facts. Some observers called what was happening an information bubble created to boost Trump's ratings ahead of the elections. Meanwhile, a similar situation was unfolding in Israel. Defense Minister Benny Gantz initially said that the operation had achieved its goals, but just a day later, he ordered preparations for new strikes. This showed that there was a crisis in how the situation was being assessed. The authorities weren't sure if they had gotten the effect they wanted and what to do next, continue the operation or look for a political solution. At the same time, international pressure intensified. The UN, the EU, China, and Russia began to speak out about the need for an immediate ceasefire. At Security Council meetings, rhetoric in favor of de-escalation intensified, especially from countries fearing that the conflict would spread to the region. For Israel, Iran's refusal to negotiate was a particularly sensitive blow. The operation to strike the Islamic Republic's nuclear infrastructure was conceived as a demonstration of resolve and strength, intended primarily to force Tehran to back down. However, instead of the expected capitulation or even a pause, Israel was met with fierce rhetoric, massive rocket attacks, proxy strikes, and an escalation of cyber warfare. The Israeli Ministry of Defense found itself in a situation where its strategic goal, to stop Iran's nuclear program, had not been achieved, and the conflict itself had deepened. The Prime Minister and security officials began to consider a longer-term military campaign. According to Channel 12, the IDF was ordered to develop a plan to suppress pro-Iranian forces throughout the Middle East. This refers not only to the IRGC, but also to Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Shiite militants in Iraq. However, this strategy requires resources, international support, and time, none of which are available. Moreover, against the backdrop of declining sympathy in Europe and growing pressure from the UN, Israel finds itself increasingly isolated. Even traditional allies are cautiously distancing themselves, fearing being drawn into a new, large-scale conflict. Meanwhile, Tehran is not missing an opportunity to use the failure of the negotiations in the information war. Propaganda is actively playing on the image of a broken West, a country that started with missiles and threats and now cannot even get Iran to agree to a formal meeting. This undermines confidence in diplomatic initiatives and forces Israeli politicians to resort to harsh statements. One Knesset member said, "There will be no more talks." The next phase is to destroy the nuclear threat at its root. Still, even the Israeli press has started asking some cautious questions. If airstrikes, diplomacy, and international resolutions haven't worked, what can stop Iran? Thus, Iran's refusal to negotiate has not only heightened military tensions, but also plunged the West and Israel into a strategic impasse in which any decision carries high risks and unpredictable consequences. Iran's decision to refuse to resume nuclear talks with the U.S. and deny the IAEA access to damaged facilities is not a spontaneous act, but a deliberate strategy. Tehran is demonstrating that it no longer believes in the effectiveness of international diplomacy in its classic form, especially when accompanied by sanctions, airstrikes, and threats. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said on state television, "Some statements, including those made by the U.S. president, are political theater. They are not backed up by facts, documents, or even proposals. We will not negotiate under bombs." For Tehran, negotiations are not just a discussion of terms, but a political tool to demonstrate strength. Iran believes that after the strikes on its nuclear facilities, any initiative from the West is not an attempt at a settlement, but a trap. The goal is to draw Iran into talks and then impose terms under pressure. In addition, the influence of the security forces has grown within the Iranian establishment. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, which has long since become a powerful political and military structure, is exerting increasing influence on foreign policy. From their point of view, any compromise with the U.S. is a sign of weakness. After the facilities in Fordow, Natanz and Isfahan were bombed, this line prevailed. The refusal to allow IAEA representatives to enter the country is another sign of this. Officially, this is explained by the security threat to the inspectors, but in reality, it is a strategic signal. Iran is temporarily suspending cooperation with international bodies, believing that they have been used against it. An additional argument. Within the country, Khamenei's statement that the Zionist regime has been almost destroyed and America has been defeated has garnered massive support. The streets of Tehran, Isfahan, and Qom were filled with demonstrations in support of the national course. This means that the Iranian leadership is not simply refusing to negotiate, it is reaping political dividends at home for doing so. The refusal to negotiate, the harsh rhetoric, and the refusal to cooperate with international bodies are merely external manifestations of Tehran's carefully thought-out strategy. Iran is acting on the principle of multi-layered pressure on its opponents, combining military, diplomatic, information, and proxy instruments. After the strikes on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, the Iranian command opted for an asymmetric response. This is not just ballistic missiles targeting U.S. bases, but also actions through allies. The Houthis in Yemen are attacking Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, Hezbollah is stepping up shelling of northern Israel, and Iraqi Shiite militias are striking U.S. convoys. At the same time, the information war is intensifying. State media are publishing materials portraying Israel as an aggressor that has lost the initiative. Videos of IRGC victories, footage of missile launches, and speeches by Khamenei and commanders are turned into media events that mobilize the domestic audience and shape the international image of a strong Iran. Tehran is also playing on the diplomatic front. Despite its isolation from the West, it is strengthening ties with China, Russia, India, and Latin American countries. These states, while not openly supporting the strikes, nevertheless refuse to join the anti-Iran sanctions. This creates a belt of stability in which Iran can continue to live and operate even under pressure. It is also important that Iran has learned from the mistakes of the past. Unlike in the 2010s, today it is not acting alone, but as the coordinator of an entire network of forces in the Middle East. This makes it less vulnerable and more flexible. Any attack on Tehran could trigger a chain reaction across the region, making military intervention extremely risky. Ultimately, the refusal to negotiate is not a rejection of dialogue in principle, but part of Iran's negotiating position. It demonstrates that if the West wants to talk, it will have to recognize Iran's strength and accept new rules of the game. Otherwise, there will be war on all fronts without restrictions. Iran's decision to refuse to resume nuclear talks with the U.S. has been one of the most alarming signals since the escalation began. This not only worsens the situation between the two countries, but also seriously affects the entire security architecture of the Middle East. First, it increases the likelihood of further escalation. Without a diplomatic corridor and IAEA monitoring, Western countries have fewer and fewer tools of deterrence. Israel is increasingly emphasizing preventive strikes. The U.S., despite public statements about its unwillingness to go to war, continues to build up its presence in the region, moving air defense systems and aircraft and strengthening bases in Iraq and Kuwait. Second, the refusal to engage in dialogue undermines trust in international institutions. Iran has directly accused the IAEA of providing a pretext for Israeli and American attacks. This unprecedented accusation essentially discredits the oversight mechanisms that have been the cornerstone of nuclear non-proliferation for decades. Third, it sets a dangerous precedent. Other countries, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and even Egypt, are watching Iran's actions closely. If the refusal to negotiate strengthens Iran's position, it could trigger a new wave of arms races and nuclear ambitions in the region. Furthermore, such a move gives China and Russia additional grounds to strengthen their cooperation with Tehran. Both countries have already criticized the U.S. for striking nuclear facilities and supported Iran's right to self-defense. This means a strengthening of the anti-Western bloc, which regional players are increasingly being drawn into. This is also an alarming signal for the global economy. Against the backdrop of escalating tensions, we are already seeing rising oil prices, stock market instability, and capital flight from countries dependent on stability in the Middle East. Thus, Iran's refusal to negotiate is not just a diplomatic move, but a new reality in which a forceful scenario is becoming dominant. The world finds itself in a situation where further developments could spiral out of control. At present, analysts are considering three possible scenarios for the situation following Iran's refusal to resume negotiations. Scenario 1. Escalation to a large-scale war. If Israel or the U.S. decide to launch new strikes on Iranian targets, especially near Tehran, this could provoke a response involving ballistic missiles, attacks by proxy groups, and possible strikes on oil infrastructure in the Persian Gulf. Such a conflict risks going beyond the regional level, with consequences for the entire global economy. Energy markets would be particularly affected. This is the most dangerous scenario. Scenario 2. A frozen conflict. The Middle East is already familiar with this format. The sides do not engage in direct warfare but continue to carry out limited strikes, increase proxy activity, and ramp up information pressure. This situation could last for years, as was the case between Israel and Hezbollah. It does not solve the problem, but it avoids disaster. Scenario 3. Return to negotiations through intermediaries. This is the least likely but most desirable scenario. It could happen if pressure from China, the UAE, Qatar, or Turkey leads to a new diplomatic format where Iran gets guarantees and the U.S. gets control mechanisms. This model will take time and concessions from both sides. With all the risks, the international community needs to act now. It is necessary to restore direct channels of communication between the U.S. and Iranian military, involve international mediators, primarily the UN and the EU, create new control formats, even if they differ from the previous JCPOA nuclear deal. It is also important to strengthen the role of civil society and independent media so that pressure comes not only from governments, but also from those living in the risk zone. After all, it is always ordinary people who pay for the mistakes of politicians. Thus, Iran's refusal is a challenge, but also an opportunity. An opportunity to rethink outdated security frameworks, rethink diplomatic approaches, and find a path to stability, even if it is through crisis. If you believe these issues are important, subscribe to our channel, share this video, and stay with us. Only together can we stand up to chaos and protect the future.